I want to talk about the Legacy Museum and the Memorial of Justice and Peace. How did the inspiration come about for the construction of the memorial as well as the Legacy Museum and just the motivation behind it?
Sure. We wanted to take on the long silence that has generally characterized our history of racial injustice. I went to South Africa. I saw the Apartheid Museum in South Africa and was really moved by the truth-telling there. I went to Berlin and saw the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin and saw a city reckoning with the history of the Holocaust. Because in Berlin, you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers and stones and emblems that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. And I think the consequence of that is progress. And I didn't see that in our country. We didn't have any major cultural institutions talking about the legacy of slavery. We didn't have a lot of spaces that were acknowledging this history of lynching. And that was the impetus for creating the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial. People don't talk about the fact that we're a post-genocide society. And I often argue that the great evil of American slavery wasn't the involuntary servitude and the forced labor. It was the false narrative that was created to justify enslavement, where they said that black people are not as good as white people, that black people are less capable, less worthy, less deserving, less human. And that narrative gave rise to this really tragic idea of racial hierarchy, of white supremacy. 6 million black people fled the American South during the first half of the 20th century. They left land that they owned. And we have a wealth gap in this country today because millions of black families forfeited their opportunity to pass on wealth to their children and grandchildren because they were unprotected by our society, by our government. And black people were pulled out of their homes, beaten, tortured, lynched on courthouse lawns, and it was traumatizing. And so I see the museum and the memorial as truth-telling spaces. And they can be hard and challenging. But what I'm trying to do, and what I'd love for us to do collectively as a society, is to open up space for the grace and mercy that comes when we have the willingness, the strength to be honest about this past.
Now, there is one part in the museum where I thought was so incredibly powerful and very unique. It was the Community Remembrance Project.
Yeah.
And where, of course, all the jars of soil are, just in remembrance of everyone who has been lynched.
Yeah.
And so I know a lot of research was probably needed for that and everything, but how did that concept come about and the research behind it?
Yeah. There are thousands of lynchings throughout this country that have never been acknowledged. And so we started working with communities to put markers at each of those lynching sites. I think if we can make that history visible, we'll make it easier for future generations to understand that history. Collecting the soil became another way to just represent the tragedy of that loss, but the promise of what we can do to create a better future. And we wanted to reflect that with each of those jars. And so we now have 800 jars in the museum, which reflect 800 communities engaging in that. And it's really powerful stuff. I talk about a woman who came to our site a couple years back and said, I want to get some soil from my community or get some soil in a community. And we gave her an empty jar and a memo that talked about the lynching. We gave everybody an implement to dig the soil. And she went to her community, which was in West Alabama, some remote place. And she told me when she got there, she got really nervous because it was in a very isolated part. But she prayed, got out of the car, went across the road, got on her knees to start digging, when all of a sudden a pickup truck came down the road, and there was this big white guy in the truck, and he stared at her, and she got scared. And then she said he parked his truck and got out and started walking toward her, and she was terrified. Her heart was pounding. And this man walked up to her, and he said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I told that man I'm digging soil here because this is where a black man was lynched, and I'm going to honor his life today." And she looked down, and she just started digging. And the man stood there, and he said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but would it be all right if I helped you?"
Wow.
And she said, "Yes." And he got down on his knees, and she offered him the implement to dig the soil. He said, "No, no, 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 you keep that. I'll just use my hands." And she said he started throwing his hands into the soil and putting it in the jar, throwing his hands into the soil. And she said there was something about the conviction with which he was putting his whole body into picking up this sword that just moved her. And he kept digging with his hands, and she kept digging with the implement, and they were getting near the top of the jar. And she said at some point she looked over and she saw that the man had turned red, that it had slowed down, his shoulders had sagged. And then she said she saw a tear running down his face. And she stopped and she put her hand on his shoulder and she said, "Are you all right?" And that's when the man said, "No, ma'am, no, ma'am, no, ma'am." And then he said, "I'm just so worried that it might have been my grandfather who helped lynch this man." Wow. And she said they both sat on that roadside and wept. And I was here when these two people who met on a roadside in a place of agony and shame and terror and violence came in together and did something beautiful. That's the power, I think, of that exhibit. It is a witness of truth-telling by all kinds of people, black people, white people, old people, young people, who have come together and want to represent that something beautiful can still be expressed despite the tragedy of this history.
Now, I noticed that some of the artists who contribute to some of the art exhibits were African, I believe from Ghana.
Yeah.
Now, how do you see that building a bridge between African Americans and Africans?
Yeah.
Do you feel like that the museum is a connection to that?
Absolutely. Our most prominent artist is a Ghanaian, Kwame Akoto-Bamfo, who's very much working in West Africa on the legacy of slavery there. We have films. We're working with Nigerian artists. We're working with people in Sierra Leone, South Africans. And, you know, Africa as a continent was also kind of torn apart and colonized and abused by European powers that created a lot of hardship for a long period of time, and we still are seeing the consequences of that. I went to Nigeria. I went to the African continent for the first time not that long ago. They sent this young African lawyer to pick me up, and he took me to the ocean, to the beach. And then I looked over at him, and he had a tear running down his face. And he looked at me and he said, "I brought you here because I wanted to say, I'm sorry, this is where we lost you." And for the first time in my life, I realized I was standing on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, on the land of my foreparents, who I had been separated from because of this tragic history. And that's the reason why the first exhibit you encounter at the Legacy Museum is that giant wall of water, which tells a powerful story. There are 2 million Africans who died during the transatlantic journey, during the Middle Passage, whose bodies are buried at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, and we haven't even acknowledged that. We've spent more money looking for trinkets from the Titanic than we've spent honoring those millions of people who died during that horrific journey. And so there is so much to be gained by repairing the breach, right? Yeah. We're called to be repairers of the breach. It's popular these days to just prioritize, you know, self-care and shielding yourself from anything hard and complicated. And I want people to take care of themselves. But I also believe that you have to be willing to do things uncomfortable and inconvenient. Because if you're not willing to do that, we're not going to make the kind of change that I think we desperately need in the world.
If you'd like the story and want to see more content like this, you can make that happen by sharing this video, follow or like us on our social media platforms, subscribe to TPI for monthly updates, become a financial partner. Head over to our website for more details.